Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Anastasia Shesterinina. She is a visiting fellow in the program on Order, Conflict, and Violence at the MacMillan Center. Her main research area is the internal dynamics of armed conflict. Professor Shesterinina recently published an article in the American Political Science Review titled Collective Threat Framing and Mobilization in Civil War. Today we'll speak with Professor Shesterinina about her book manuscript, Mobilizing Under Uncertainty, which examines how ordinary people navigate the uncertainty of war's onset to arrive at different mobilization decisions and from fleeing to fighting in civil war. Welcome, Professor Shesterinina.
Thank you so much, Marilyn, and thank you for inviting me to talk about my book today.
My pleasure. Let's start with an overview of your book. Tell us about it.
So the book draws on the dissertation research that I conducted between 2010 and 2013 in Abkhazia, which is a breakaway territory of Georgia in the Caucasus, and which has fascinated me for many, many years. And so the book tackles the question that you have voiced already, a very important but understudied question of how do ordinary people navigate this immense uncertainty that they face when violence begins, when the war starts, and how do they arrive at very different decisions from fleeing to fighting in civil war. And so I take an insider perspective, the views of the very actors involved in mobilization, to think through these questions and to also introduce two novel aspects of how we can think about this in terms of, one, the range of mobilization decisions, and two, the process by which people arrive at these decisions. And so in contrast to major theories that exist out there on mobilization, which start from the assumption of people's knowledge of risk and build their theories based on this assumption, I argue that people come to perceive the anticipated risk or threat of mobilization in different ways, and this process shapes their mobilization trajectories. So when faced with violence and war, people do not simply decide to fight or not based on some given notion of risk, but rather draw on their preceding experiences of intergroup conflict and social networks at the time of mobilization to decide who needs protection and how to provide it.
Okay, let's talk about the term mobilization. What does that mean specifically?
Absolutely. First of all, I argue that mobilization does not start with the recruitment of fighters by armed groups in civil war. It is an ongoing process that involves organization of and participation in collective action, which spans pre-war, wartime, and post-war stages of the conflict. And so in this process, everyday confrontation, political contention, violent opposition that take place before the war shape how people understand the conflict and their role in it, but also place people in different groups or social networks that experience the conflict differently. And so at the war's onset, these shared understandings of history and identity, what I call collective conflict identities, play a critical role of helping people to understand with whom to mobilize, but also, most importantly for me, for whom to mobilize. And so at the war's onset, mobilization means a range of decisions across a continuum from fleeing, hiding, attempting to hold neutrality to protect oneself, to fleeing, hiding, attempting to hold neutrality to protect family and friends, hence adopting these roles together with family and friends, to then mobilization in the support apparatus as doctors, nurses, cooks, war journalists, etc., to then fighters who mobilize to protect the kin, localities, or the collectivity as a whole. So this is a continuum that I'm thinking about, and most importantly, when you think about mobilization decisions on behalf of the group as a whole, it very often takes fighters away from the localities where they can relatively safely mobilize together with their local groups into the areas of highest intensity fighting, such as the capital or other strategically important locales. And so, of course, individuals can shift between these roles in the course of the war, but then at the time when the war is over, post-war violence, civil war recidivism that has been recorded in most cases of civil war in most countries that have experienced civil war mean continued mobilization, either to protect or challenge these war outcomes. So what I think is that if we isolate any of these aspects of mobilization, we lose a sense of its ongoing nature. And also we lose a sense of the causal effects that prior experience of intergroup conflict has on the actions and decisions that follow.
Okay. And how did you do the research for the book? Tell us about your methodology.
That's a great question. Of course, political violence and war are extremely challenging issues to study. And being in an isolated environment such as Abkhazia, which is once again a de facto state, a breakaway state, adds a set of additional layers of challenges for the researcher. But if we have a consensus in Civil War studies, it is that we need to tap into the local processes of Civil War. And so in order to do that, I embedded myself in the local communities of Abkhazia for 8 months. I selected these communities based on the variation in wartime territorial control. So areas where the Georgian forces had control, those where the Abkhaz forces had control, and the areas where this control shifted. And having selected these areas then, my goal was to find individuals within each of these locales who participated in the war in different ways that I have discussed, or decided not to participate in the war by attempting to flee, hide, etc. So it was incredibly difficult to achieve a balanced sample between these different categories of fighters, but what helped is devising this strategy of not only relying on my networks, on the gatekeepers in the field, but also going to approach my respondents in their location of employment, for example, when I consider it to be ethical, of course. And so having selected this relatively representative sample of respondents, then what I did was long interviews on the life histories from the pre-war to wartime to post-war periods in order to capture these interactions between people's experiences of conflict before the war, during, and after. And so these interviews were on average 3 hours, but sometimes lasted up to 6 hours. They also placed me in very close relationships with the people that I worked with, of course, and that helped a lot because it requires a lot of trust to be able to talk about these issues of violence. But at the same time, I needed to figure out how could these responses be affected by what is happening in Abkhazia today. Or by the political loyalties before the war, for instance. So in order to try and tackle these potential biases in the interviews, what I did were participant observation and collection of an extensive set of archival materials, news, comparable interview data sets even from the wartime and midway between the war and my research. So this helped me arrive at a more comprehensive image of mobilization in the case and draw these conclusions that may push our understanding of mobilization a little bit further.
Okay. As you're in the field, were you in danger at any point? Because there was actual fighting going on, no?
So the fighting was not going on at the time when I was doing my field work.
Okay.
What was going on were different sets of post-war violence that actually prevented me from working in certain areas of Abkhazia. And those areas are specifically the areas along the administrative border between Abkhazia and Georgia, where continued events of violence have been ongoing for decades now, much less at the time of my fieldwork, but much more prior to that. And so I had to devise a strategy of dealing with that. And the secondary archives of interviews that I mentioned were actually helpful to tackle that problem. I tried to get at other researchers' interviews from the area that I could not access in order to, of course, be ethical toward myself and not put myself in danger. But at the same time, I had to think through a lot of backup options. Where is it safe to conduct an interview?
Sure.
How safe is it to arrive to the interview location by myself or together with an interlocutor. Most often I conducted interviews in public places, especially with individuals whom I had not known prior to the interview. In other situations, I lived with families very often, and so it helped me find those moments of trust where I could say, yes, I can potentially arrive at this person's home and conduct the interview there. But of course, my own security was not the major concern. The major concern is, how do I protect in an ongoing way from the time of the fieldwork to up until today the respondents who have accepted to share with me their stories and who have been really generous in providing these stories. And so I could talk on and on about these things, but one of the strategy has been to be incredibly careful in not identifying any of the locations, any of the potential personal details that can indicate who actually spoke with me, but rather present these narratives as broader mobilization trajectories. But also talk to the local actors themselves and draw on their knowledge of what is safe and what is not.
Right. I am curious in terms of, let me ask you first, how many interviews did you conduct for this book?
Thank you so much for that question. I conducted 150 interviews in Abkhazia.
And over what time period?
Over 2010. Oh, actually, the interviews were conducted over 2011 and 2013 because 2010 was my preliminary trip, where I probed the feasibility of the research, the questions that people are responsive to, and actually worked on my research design. But also 30 interviews were conducted outside of Abkhazia with people who were displaced from Abkhazia into Georgia, with experts in Georgia and also Russia, because these are the other actors, of course, in the conflict that I need to consider. But the main body of interviews is from the Abkhaz context, and this is a relatively balanced sample of 150 interviews.
Okay. Did you find any difference in terms of socioeconomic status, people who are well off versus people who weren't so well off?
In terms of their mobilization decisions?
Yes, exactly.
So we are talking about a context that is actually quite fascinating in that way. We're talking about the Soviet context, where the state worked so hard to attempt to equalize the population, to attempt to represent the population in the different spheres of the society relatively equally. Of course, this does not mean that socioeconomic difference did not exist, but what it meant was that in most cases, at least with the respondents whom I have conducted my research, people were able to access socioeconomic opportunities that I actually arrived thinking that wouldn't be available to them. So for instance, I have a lot of interviews where individuals admit that they worked in the state apparatus, being Abkhaz, for instance, and the Abkhaz were a minority in Abkhazia at the time of the Soviet Union and at the time of the war. And so in a way that was surprising, but in another way that helped me keep constant some of the macro-structural factors that could potentially explain these different mobilization decisions and tap into the very micro-level processes that were going on when the war began.
Okay. And what about gender differences? You talked to both men and women. Did you find any differences there?
Absolutely. I talked to both men and women. In fact, my sample is quite balanced on the gender dynamics, but also the interviews that I conducted demonstrate so clearly the gendered nature of mobilization in civil war, and particularly in this case where most of the men who were in the participant roles were the fighters, most of the women were in the support apparatus, for instance, as nurses, cooks, other types of support. In terms of fleeing as well, we see a very gender dynamic. A lot of women fled with the children, of course, and you have an overrepresentation of women among those who fled, because very often men maintained their position in the society by fighting on the Abkhaz side.
So I'm curious how you got at the people who were fleeing, because it seems would they flee to other parts or flee completely to another country?
This is an excellent question because that was exactly what I needed to establish. They fled both within the country. When the Georgian forces advanced into Abkhazia in mid-August 1992, what happened was on the 14th of August, the Georgian forces advanced into the west of Abkhazia, and on the 15th, they encircled Abkhazia from the east, from the seaside, which created this variation in the areas of Abkhaz and Georgian control at the war's onset. And so at the beginning of the war, which is the main moment of my research, it was still possible to flee both outside of Abkhazia, but also within. And so what you saw was a lot of families and groups of friends fled into Gudauta in central Abkhazia, which was under Abkhaz control. But also others were still able to flee either to Russia by the main road that connects the territory of Abkhazia from east to west, or through the sea. So that was the situation at the war's onset, which of course changed as the war intensified, when these options were relatively limited, when the tightened control at the border with Russia meant that people could not flee to Russia anymore, and the continued fleeing was mostly within Abkhazia. So all of these different types of fleeing, I of course consider and think through, and how do you explain, for instance, this type of variation?
Is there any overriding rationale from people who were fighting for them to fight basically? And was there any reason, overwhelming reason for them to take up fight versus not?
Absolutely. When I think about this question, the most important aspect for me is to try and understand how did the pre-war experiences of intergroup conflict affect these decisions? Is it true that the pre-war evolution of the conflict, which led to the point where the Abkhaz national movement was fighting for separation of Abkhazia from Georgia, did this affect the ordinary people that I'm studying in a uniform way? Did this affect them in different ways depending on their participation in these pre-war mobilization events? So what I find is that in order for us to understand these motivations, we of course cannot forget the history of the conflict that happened before the war, but neither can we find all of the answers to the variation in mobilization decisions in the pre-war period. Situational factors at the war's onset matter. And in particular, the social networks with which people experienced conflict in a different way before the war, and most importantly, with which they mobilized at the war's onset, very often pushed people in different directions in terms of mobilization. So I mentioned the social process that I'm looking at. Most all respondents in my research reported that they turned to their social networks of national, local, and quotidian daily relationships to understand what was going on at the war's onset and make these different decisions. So what happened is information filtered from national leaders, which captured these overall frames, right? We need to be separate after a history of Georgianization of Abkhazia, when we were not allowed to speak Abkhaz, when our schools were closed, when we didn't have equal opportunities, to then adaptation of this broad narrative at the local level, which very often shifted mobilization from we're going to fight for the collectivity as a whole to we need to protect our city, town, our neighborhood at the local level. But then mobilization decisions and the motivations were consolidated at the quotidian level of family and friends, which meant that very often people who were even very well positioned to be motivated to fight fled instead to protect their families. So depending on whom you mobilized with, these normative motivations of protecting one's own security, of protecting one's family, one's locality, or the collectivity were shaped by these social networks. And so in terms of the overall logic then, Yes, most people shared experiences of the conflict before the war, but these experiences were filtered in different ways by the networks with whom they mobilized at the war's onset to then produce these different mobilization decisions. So it's a very complicated social process of information filtering, which moves us beyond simple instrumental or normative motivations to then consider how did a highly politicized individual end up fleeing, or on the other hand, how did a person who never participated in mobilization before the war ended up defending their group, very often at the beginning without any weapons. So it's easy to discount some of the former decisions as cost-benefit, self-interested motivations, but this logic does not apply to the second set of decisions, which means that something else is driving the variation, which I argue is the social process of information filtering.
Okay, so in terms of that social process, did you ask the people you interviewed, what was the defining moment for you when you made that decision to either fight or flee?
Absolutely. Most of the interview, in fact, focused on the 4 days of the 100-year conflict. And these 4 days I spoke to individuals about in terms of both very detailed trajectories of where were you when the Georgian forces entered, where did you go thereafter, how did you decide where to go thereafter, how did you decide whom to connect with, whom to call, or did you simply see the Georgian troops advancing? What was this kind of first contact with the moment of the war's onset? And then what did you do next? Most often people say that as soon as they heard that the Georgian forces have arrived in Abkhazia, they collectively went to these common places of assembly, which are typically squares in front of administration buildings, churches, local gathering places. And that was one of the second set of critical moments. The first one being, how did I even learn that the Georgian forces are here? The second being this local kind of gathering that typically took place across Abkhazia. But the third one, the most important moment, was once these local decisions were started to be made, people typically broke down into groups of their closest friends and family. And people typically say that we decided collectively with this group of 5 to 10 friends or family members to do this or the other option. And so the implications of this were dramatic. The Abkhaz force that formed at the war's onset was built on these tightly knit groups of family and friends, and the structure, this composition of the force was then relatively maintained throughout the war, which of course increased the cohesion of the Abkhaz force, and which then greatly impacted the way in which people treated war's outcomes and participated in post-war protection of what the Abkhaz considered the Abkhaz victory in the Georgian-Abkhaz War of 1992-93.
Okay, I know you're still finishing up your book, but I am curious to know, what would you like someone to take away ultimately from reading your book?
This is a very broad but excellent question. There are a number of things that I would like to highlight. First, that it is incredibly important for us to understand not only the decisions of leadership, the decisions of insurgent leaders or organizers or administrators, but also of ordinary people who join mobilization. Without understanding these decisions, we cannot really figure out how did this clash evolve into a war, or how did a moment of killing took on a mass character. But at the same time, while we think through this, it is incredibly important to realize the dilemmas that people face at the war's onset. Had the Abkhaz not taken up arms, the Georgian advance into Abkhazia in 1992 may not have turned into a war that lasted over a year and that displaced most of the Georgian population from Abkhazia. Many of these people were friends. Many of these people were family members. And these are critical dilemmas that people think through and actually discuss at the war's onset. And one of the most important things that I hope to achieve in the book is to demonstrate that it is not a simple cost-benefit logic that drives people to adopt these choices. It is a very difficult set of deliberations and dilemmas that people have to tackle in order to make these difficult decisions.
Right, okay, so we will look forward to your book, and I know you're kind of looking forward to your next project. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So having studied a war that took place over 2 decades before, I think it's time for me to start thinking about how I could respond to the challenges that we have today in terms of armed conflict. And of course, the place that is very close to home, I did grow up in the former Soviet Union. This is one of the major motivations for my work today. The waves of mobilization in the past impacted me greatly as a scholar. And so when I think about the region, of course, Ukraine comes to mind. And of course, the situation in Crimea is on my mind as I'm writing this book and as I'm thinking about what would be the best way for me to once again conduct the research with the very individuals who are participating in these deadly, dramatic processes that we're facing today, and how can I carry out this work ethically, which is the most important consideration for me, so that the people who are already endangering themselves, who are already at risk, that their conversations with me, for instance, through interviews or through my participant observation in Ukraine, are not further endangered by this research.
Right.
So these are the sets of questions that I'm tackling with right now to start understanding how can I compare, for instance, mobilization that happened in Abkhazia to what is going on today in Ukraine.
Right, right. Well, I think what you're doing is very important work, and I thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Marilyn.
Okay. For more information about Professor Shesterinina and her research, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.